When I was 11 or 12 in Ithaca, New York, I took up playing the guitar. The guitar was an instrument everyone wanted to know how to play in those days. There were folk musicians playing on TV who were getting lots of attention. They played the guitar. I had a friend, Greg Young, who played the guitar quite well. He was in a trio kind of based on the Kingston Trio or the Limelighters or one of those groups. So I asked Greg where he had learned to play. And he told me he had a teacher named Henry Dunn, lived out near the airport, beyond the airport. So I called Henry Dunn and we arranged to try out guitar lessons. We both knew it might or might not take. I had already tried violin lessons downtown as part of the public school program, violin lessons, for $5, I think, cost $5 for a scholastic term, like a 3-month period. I hadn't even lasted the 3 months. I hadn't done my scales, I hadn't studied, I hadn't worked at it, I hadn't had any interest in learning how to play the violin. It had dropped away. I think I was 8 years old during that experience. But the guitar, I thought I was really interested in. I talked my parents into buying me the cheapest guitar offered from the music store down on, I think, Aurora Street in downtown Ithaca. McNeil's music store, that was it. They sold records, they sold instruments, not much of real high quality in any department, except the records were good. And in those days, you'd go to McNeil's music store and you'd listen to records in a little booth. You'd try them out first, listen to Peter, Paul, and Mary sing Blowing in the Wind in this booth and see if that was the album you wanted to buy. Well, I got their affordable nylon stringed guitar, classical guitar. I think it cost $40. My parents thought that was quite a gamble based on my violin experience, but they were willing to try it. I started going to Henry Dunn, and I liked going to Henry Dunn. He would suggest things, and I would practice them on my own. I had the impulse to want to practice the guitar. It took. And after a while, after a year or so, I think Henry must have called my parents. And I think it must have been my father he got on the phone. And he must have told Dad, look, Dick is a promising student at the guitar, but this guitar he has is not good enough for him. He needs a real instrument. This guitar I had was heavy. You'd lift it up and it was heavy. It was thick wood around the body. Must not have resonated worth anything. And a big, thick neck. It was difficult to press the strings down for my little fingers or for anybody's fingers because it wasn't much of a guitar. It had the feeling that it had been made with plywood or something when it's supposed to be made of rosewood. It happened that not so long after that phone call, Dad had a conference in Mexico to go to. He was an agricultural economist. He was working on helping the grain yield, the corn yield, the rice yield in various underdeveloped parts of the world. When he got back, and Mom and I went out to meet him at the airport, as we usually did, on this Mohawk Airlines flight, DC-3, flying up from New York after he'd flown back from Mexico City on a big plane to New York. Dad was the last to get off the plane, as usual. He usually sat in the back. He waited for other people to get off, then he would get off. He couldn't be troubled to be standing and jostling with the others in a hurry to get off. He got off last, and in one hand, he was carrying a guitar. in his hand. It wasn't in a case. It was in a flimsy, transparent plastic bag. He had carried it all the way from Mexico City on one plane after another, probably held it between his knees on the plane. He had talked to a Mexican colleague of his, a man he knew, and he knew that this man played the guitar himself. He lived in Mexico City. He asked him if there was a place Dad, could go to shop for a good, inexpensive guitar. And the man said, "Oh, Art, rather than explain to you, I think I should go get it for you, and you can pay me back. I can bargain with the man who made it. I can get a better deal. I know where to go, where they do the best work, and I'll get you a fine guitar for not too much money." And so he did. The man brought him back to the conference, a $20 Mexican guitar, which would have cost hundreds in the States. It was a beautiful little guitar. Actually, it wasn't little. It was the same size as my other one, but it was notches and notches better. It was a lovely, light, delicate guitar. Maybe I call it a little guitar because it was a feather compared to this old plywood hulk that I'd had before. I bought myself a cardboard case to keep it in, and I was set. I showed it off proudly to Henry Dunn. He was pleased. It was so much better. He said, "This is great. You're going to learn even better than you did before now." I learned, to my satisfaction, to play the guitar quite well. I could play Romance Antigo, the classical piece that every beginner learns. Mostly I learned folk songs because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to sing in my thin, high voice and play the guitar and feel like I was some sort of a folk singer somewhere. And I learned little subtleties on the guitar. I had a touch for it to a certain extent. I played for hours and hours at a time, the way anyone who's really learning an instrument plays, from a self-generated energy. Not because someone had told me to learn certain scales, but because I loved playing and I was determined to learn new things. One time Henry Dunn had a gig playing at the School of Animal Husbandry at Cornell. He was going to be paid $10 to entertain there. He invited me to go along and share the limelight there with him, and we would share the $10 payment. He said, as my part of the $10, I could buy a record at the McNeil music store, and I think I did buy a Peter, Paul, and Mary album with my share of the takings, which I wasn't to know this at the time, but that would be practically my entire lifetime income as a musician. The high point for me was when Carlos Montoya, the flamenco guitar virtuoso, came to Ithaca to give a concert at Bailey Hall. The morning before his concert, in lieu of my guitar lesson that week, Henry Dunn took me to Carlos Montoya's hotel room because they were old friends, he and Carlos Montoya. And we watched for an hour as Carlos Montoya warmed up and practiced and went through his daily drills, played these long sections with one hand, his left hand only, and did very fast tremolo things that you couldn't even follow with your eye. They were astonishing. And I noticed that he held his guitar at an incline away from him. Maybe it made it easier for his right hand. Anyway, he was playing without looking at the strings, without looking at the guitar at all. And he could play these wondrous riffs just with his left hand. He was a genius and a great guitar player. I felt myself in a magic sort of aura to be in his presence just for a while he was doing his real work, his practice. And that night, when we went to the concert, I didn't sit with Henry Dunn. He was sitting somewhere else, but my seat happened to be right in front of Carlos Montoya. And every now and then, while he was playing, sitting there, and he would let his hands go off on their own, as if his mind was wandering, he would look down at me and give me a beautiful, radiant smile as he was playing. One thing that had happened at the end of his practice session, before Henry and I were to leave, Henry said to him, "Now, Senor Montoya, would it be all right if we played a duet for you? I'd like to show you how this boy plays the guitar." Carlos Montoya says, "Yes, it would be an honor," in his thick Spanish accent. He sat on his bed and very seriously listened while Henry and I played the duet of Romance Antigo. The first guitar, the part I had learned, was easier than the harmonizing guitar that Henry played. I had not brought my guitar to this meeting because I wasn't expecting to be playing for the great man. But I played it on Henry's guitar, which was very fancy. It was a $400 guitar bought in Spain for $400. I had never played it before. And Henry played Carlos Montoya's guitar because they were friends and knew and trusted each other. Romance Antigo. Da, 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 da. I played it. I was nervous. I didn't play it as well as I might have other times when I was practicing, but I did my best. I had my fingernails long on these 3 fingers so that they could pluck the strings correctly for classical technique. It wasn't a flamenco piece. It was a classical guitar piece. I still have my fingernails long, even though I hardly ever play the guitar now. My others are all short, but these 3. And Carlos Montoya listened very courteously, with great deference to a boy who was trying hard to learn to play the guitar. It was a serious moment we all shared together. And when we finished the piece, he leaned forward, he nodded at me like a wonderful uncle or grandfather, and he said, "Practice, practice." And then it was that night that he played at Bailey Hall and would look down and beam at me every now and then. It was pure magic. I also played for my family. I'd force them to listen to me singing one folk song or another, and I couldn't tell if they enjoyed it or not. They would be quiet in the evening after supper when we were sitting around, fire going in the fireplace. Maybe it was Christmas vacation and everyone was assembled at home. They were polite, and I couldn't tell if my parents enjoyed hearing me play or sing. When my father was failing, was old, and we were wishing really that he would die because he was so diminished within himself that he was miserable, and we were miserable for him. He did have moments of lucidity. And one time, we were down in North Carolina at my brother Bill's house. Dad and I were sitting alone in a room. And he surprised me by saying, "Now, do you have your guitar here?" And I said, "Yeah, Dad, I've got it here someplace. I don't play it that often now, but it's here." "Would you play for me?" he said. And I said, "Oh, Dad, of course I will. What would you like to hear? Is there something in particular?" And he said, "Do you still know Railroad Bill? I used to love hearing you sing Railroad Bill." I said, "Of course, Dad, I'd be happy to play that for you." And I got my guitar. I got it in tune. No one came in to interrupt us. Did I remember Railroad Bill? It was there in my bones. My fingers remembered it on their own. And I played a soft, poignant version of Railroad Bill. Railroad Bill lives way up on Railroad Hill. Ride, ride, ride. Played the instrumental section, sang another verse, played the instrumental section again. Watched Dad's face. He was smiling. I was smiling. I put the guitar away. I never told anyone about that, anyone in my family. Dad said, when we were sitting there again in the room, he said, "That's the best $20 I ever spent." Railroad Bill, Railroad Bill, lives way up on Railroad Hill. Ride, ride, ride.